Okay, so welcome everybody to this second session after lunch. What I want to do for the next roundabout, let me just take a look, 17 minutes is to take you on a journey. Take you on a journey into, let's say, the mindset and the problems of a vulnerability researcher, somebody who has found a vulnerability and maybe wants to do something good. So let's just start with the basic idea that you are that hypothetical vulnerability researcher, or you found a bug in a software somewhere, something that can be exploited. So what to do with that kind of information? Well, the first thing that many might think of is, well, I'm a good guy, or I'm a good gal, depends. Let's just be nice, let's just be a nice cyber citizen and tell the vendor about this vulnerability. Well, this works sometimes, but many cases, vendors who are not out of the security or cybersecurity area react with some kind of legal answers. You found a bug in our software, we sue you. So if you found a bug, let's say in a web application that you shouldn't have had access to, if you do find let's say a vulnerability in some kind of drones or drones back-end systems, by the way, that's a pretty nice read because DJI actually had an active bug bounty program but complained to this vulnerability researcher that the bugs that he found didn't fall under that program, so they actually threatened him to sue him. It's, by the way, an interesting read. If you want to know how companies might react to bad news about their products, I can really give you one hint. Read that report. Basically, that researcher walked away from $3,000 worth of $30,000 worth of bug bounty just because he couldn't cope with the reaction that he got from this company. So you might think that this is just a single incident. Well, trust me, it's not. Many companies who say, well, we are open to security reports, just send in the bug reports, just send in the vulnerabilities, in many cases do react a bit strange when they're really challenged. So this is just one of those examples. There are a few more. Just do yourself a favor. Just Google for, let's say, vulnerability and legal, let's say, legal action, things like that. And this leads to some pretty drastic reactions. That's the newest one. Basically, a security researcher which found a 0-day vulnerability in Windows and was so fed up with this whole system, how, let's say, companies are reacting or not reacting, that he or she, based on the picture, might be a she basically posted that vulnerability on Twitter with a link to GitHub for a 0-day exploit. So if you find something, well, you could try to be the good citizen. Just be prepared that if you're working with a company who doesn't like having bad press, you might get some, let's say, legal slashback. Okay, so the good way didn't work. Let's just go to the opposite side. Let's try to sell that vulnerability in the underground. You know, those Russian underground sites or those Brazilian banking sites, things like that. Let's sell them the exploit as expensive as possible. Well, sorry, let's say, to destroy that illusion, but that doesn't work. There is an active market for exploits in several undergrounds worldwide. No questions asked. However, do yourself a favor. If you are a cyber criminal, think like a cyber criminal. If you're a cyber criminal, what's your goal? Your goal is to make money as much as possible. This also means that you want to spend as less as possible on your tools, which includes vulnerabilities. So, given the fact that the majority of consumer users do not update on a regular basis, why, if I'm a cyber criminal, why should I spend thousands or millions of dollars on 0-day exploits if the 2, 3, or in some cases 10-year-old flash exploit works the same? So if you take a look, and that's, by the way, an interesting study from Recorded Future, if you take a look at the top 10 used exploits in malware and exploit kits, you will see that a lot of them are pretty old by zero-day standards. So you can still gain a pretty large infection rate by using exploits from 2015, 2014, because in many cases, people are not updating their systems. So once again, why should somebody in the underground, a cyber criminal, spend a lot of money for a zero-day exploit that doesn't have any, let's say, large impact on his infection rate? They don't. So we tried the good approach from a moral point of view. We tried the bad one, didn't work either. So let's do something in between. I've heard some rumors that there are some companies out there who do pay a whole lot of money for vulnerabilities. Trust me, there are, and I will show you two of them. The first one is CrowdFence. And the interesting thing about CrowdFence is the fact that they actually published numbers. So they were financed in a kind of VC model. So we as an industry, we know pretty well how much money, let's say, in their account they actually do have. So they were funded with around about $10 million US. And their goal was to spend this money on buying exploits. So good news for you, if you, by accident, for instance, stumble up on a remote code execution vulnerability in iOS, which gives you persistence, this might qualify you for around about 1.5 to 3 million US dollars. That's quite a lot of money. The interesting thing here is that they make this whole process pretty simple for you. So basically, you send in, let's say, the vulnerability that you found, a description of that vulnerability based on those categories. They will try to evaluate the value if they're interested in that value and that vulnerability. And if they are, well, basically you hand over the information and you will receive the money. Pretty simple. And they're not the only ones. I just took another example, just to give you some numbers. That's Zerodium. They offer a whole bunch of different, let's say, prices and values. So depending on whether you're on Windows or Mac or Linux. Once again, the interesting thing is that's the chart for, let's say, desktop operating systems or desktops in general. If you are into the mobile space, and it doesn't really matter whether it's Android or iOS, you can make a lot more money. So once again, I think the highest paying amount here is something like $3 million for a remote jailbreak for iOS. So if you happen to stumble upon a bug in iOS which allows you to remotely jailbreak that device without user interaction, you can get a whole lot of money. And again, the process is pretty similar. You describe that vulnerability. The vulnerability is checked by Zerodium or by that company. They decide whether it's worth their money, and if it is, you hand over the vulnerability, the proof of concept code, and you will receive the money. So let's just try to rephrase that. You did find a vulnerability. You tried it, or you didn't try it to, let's say, send it over to the vendor because you think, well, I have no, let's say, I don't want to risk any kind of legal stuff or legal lawsuit. Well, I tried to sell it in the underground. They didn't pay very well. So let's just go to those guys and do not care about legal implications or getting paid from the Russian underground. Those guys are quite good in actually paying out the money. Well, yes and no. There is one important point which is missing in both those processes. Have you seen that those companies actually disclose the vulnerability to the affected vendor? They don't. So the bad news here is, by selling this vulnerability to those kind of companies, you're basically making the world unsafe for most, or basically for all of us, because those vulnerabilities will just be sold to a very, very restricted number of clients, basically leaving the vulnerability in the product for the next, I don't know, 15, 20, 30 years in worst case. And you can be sure that if this vulnerability is in the code, at one point in time, either somebody else will discover it, and you will hit the jackpot because all the PCs haven't been patched yet, because the vulnerability was not disclosed to the vendor, or even worse, somebody attacks those companies, somebody succeeds in stealing their bought exploits and simply providing it, let's say, to the underground market for free. That's something that we saw in the case, for instance, of Hacking Team. It's an Italian vendor of software for law enforcement, which was hacked, and basically the hackers stole their exploits and put them on the internet for free. If you think back of WannaCry, the basic exploit in WannaCry, Eternal Blue, was known for a pretty long time before. So, yes, you do get your money, no questions asked, but this might make the whole setup, the whole cybersecurity setup, more insecure for all of us. So, is there another possibility, or is there another way to do it? And the answer is yes. Just a warning, that's no marketing yet. There are several, let's say, vulnerability or bug bounty programs out there, third-party bug bounty programs, where if you find something, you can basically send in this information to those guys, and they will deal with the vendor. They might risk the legal implications. I think most of you have heard of Google Project Zero, but if you think about Facebook, if you think about USCert, or Flexera. Flexera might be something that might be known to most of you as Secunia Research in the past. I mean, these are basically third-party bug bounty programs. And being Trend Micro, I will talk about the so-called Zero-Day Initiative for the next around about 5 minutes. Because Zero-Day Initiative is the bug bounty program that we run as Trend Micro. Some of you might know the Zero-Day Initiative from Tipping Point, and Trend Micro bought Tipping Point in 2015, and thus we came also to Zero-Day. And the Zero-Day Initiative basically is a twofold thing. First of all, it provides an alternative marketplace for selling vulnerabilities. So if you find something, you can basically sell the vulnerability to the Zero-Day Initiative. Although I have to admit, the prices are not that high with Zero-Day, but not another thing. The other point is that we have more than 3,000, let's say, researchers worldwide that on a constant basis do active research for vulnerabilities. So it's a marketplace on the one hand, and it's also some kind of, let's say, distribution and exchange channel for vulnerabilities. The big difference, however, is if the Zero-Day Initiative buys or detects or, let's say, finds a vulnerability, we actually disclose that vulnerability to the vendor. So if you take a look at the timeline, if somebody sells a vulnerability to ZDI, to Zero-Day Initiative, or if the Zero-Day Initiative finds a vulnerability, we actually disclose that vulnerability to the vendor, and at the same time, we provide some kind of, we call it digital vaccine, kind of filter which prevents this vulnerability from being exploited. So the advantage for Trend Micro is the fact that we can provide the security to our customers before the patch even has been released. And on average, in 2017, this meant an average protection time of 72 days before the actual patch was released by the vendor. But still, even if you're not a Trend Micro customer, you do participate in Zero-Day Initiative because we send all those vulnerabilities to the vendor, and the vendor can then decide to actually patch the stuff. So it's kind of best of both worlds. Just to give you an, let's say, quick overview, that's for 2017, the overall number of, let's say, vulnerability reports from those players was around about 1,550 vulnerabilities, with Zero-Day Initiative having the majority of them, I think something like 66%. So there are a lot of vulnerabilities that do get let's say, sent over to ZDI and which are disclosed to the vendors, which are not, let's say, kept secret and making it, let's say, insecure for everybody else, but instead we disclose them to the vendors, making it at least possible to make it safer for each of us. It's also quite interesting because when we actually bought the Zero Day Initiative, the first thing that those guys did was they took a look at Trend Micro's software. So if you take a look for 2017, the majority of the vulnerabilities found was in a Trend Micro product. This didn't go very well with the board, but still, that's how it should work, because if we know those vulnerabilities, then we can fix them and make it safer for everybody. And just to give you another example, that's the, let's say, preliminary number for first half of 2018. You would see other vendors, and you would see a lot of focus on especially industrial-related vulnerabilities. So you would see a lot of vulnerabilities in HMI equipment, in SCADA controllers, in IoT devices, which were disclosed this year. To make a long story short, ZDI is an alternative. If you don't want to deal, let's say, with the legal department of your vendor, just give us the vulnerability, sell us the vulnerability. We love to deal with those legal departments. On the other hand, you can make sure that we know the disclosure process with different vendors, and we go through it. We will disclose that vulnerability, and if the vendor doesn't react, we will publish it. So this makes it possible to have, let's say, a more secure environment for all of us and still make some money out of it. So if you take a look, for instance, at Adobe or Microsoft, the average number of days that you were protected before actual patch release on the Microsoft side was 42 days. If you go for Adobe, it was something like 63. Over all products, the average was 72 days of protection before everybody else. To come to a conclusion, to come back to the initial, let's say, title of the presentation, what's the good, what's the bad, what's the ugly? I don't want to talk about whether some business models are legal or not. If you sell to the underground, that's clearly illegal. But if you sell to, let's say, vulnerability brokers, that's a legal business model. It might be legal, it might be a moral, let's say, choice that you have to make, but it's still legal. So, except for deciding whether it's just a white hat or legal approach, whether it's a gray area in between or something purely illegal, you also have to take into consideration the moral implications of making the world safer for everybody of us. So that's why I'm going to the good, the bad, which is the underground, and the ugly, which in my personal opinion are those vulnerability brokers, which do buy those vulnerabilities but do not disclose them with the vendors, and thus robbing us as the cyber community of the chance to make everybody, let's say, everybody and everything safer. Thank you very much. If you have any further questions on the topic or anything else, we're still on the booth. Just come by, have a quick chat with us. Thank you very much for your participation. Thank you much for being here, and maybe see you later at the booth. Thank you.